For those of you that don't know, this event is sponsored by Be the People nonprofit. Instead of We the People, it's Be the People. And it is a 501c3, meaning that we don't endorse political candidates. But the mission of the Be the People nonprofit is to teach people about conservative values and principles from a Judeo-Christian perspective. Enough said? And we're taking our educational role very seriously. We've had three American Dream conferences. I think James has spoken at two of them in various capacities. And we have brought in, it kicks off with a dinner and speakers and entertainment, but then the next day, it's usually a Friday, Saturday, it's all educational panels with people from around the country. I'm not sure what the next one will be about. It could be academic integrity. So that's what we do. And my name is Carol Swain. And part of what makes me strange or unusual is that I come from a place where you don't normally get a person who spends, their life in academia. I was a high school dropout, one of 12 children born and raised in rural poverty in southwestern Virginia. I got a high school equivalency, which is a GED. I went to a community college and got the first of 5 college and university degrees. I have a degree in business, 1 in criminal justice, 2 in political science, and 1 in law. My last degree was from Yale University Law School, was a master's in law. So I can say that I've had a degree from every type of American institution, from community college, small liberal arts universities, big state universities, and then finally the Ivy League. And I was tenured early at Princeton University and then became tenured there. And then Vanderbilt recruited me in 1998. And at that time, I was going through sort of like a spiritual journey that they hired me and promoted me to full professorship. That's when I went to Yale and got my law degree. But while I was there, I had a Christian conversion experience. And so when I showed up on the campus, I was not the person they hired, and that made for an unhappy marriage. And in 2017, I took early retirement. And so that's the backstory on me. And I'm old. I was born in 1954, and that was the year of the Brown v. Board of Education school desegregation case. And yet, even though the Supreme Court ruled in 1954, I would attend segregated schools up until 1968. And my talk today, I'm going to talk some about the civil rights movement, because most of the people in here are too young to have actually witnessed it, but a little bit about the civil rights movement, because for people who have looked at the 1960s, to us, it's like the world went to hell in a handbasket. But James's lecture about Marxism and all the things that were taking place, by the time you get to the 1960s, all those efforts have begun to bear fruit. And you see it with the Supreme Court decisions, as well as what was taking place in the country. So that's a little bit of background. Okay, communism and civil rights are intertwined. I bet you didn't know that. And they're intertwined because of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and America that took place between 1947 and I believe 1992. That Cold War benefited Black Americans, because during World War II, during the Korean War, you had Black soldiers fighting for America when they were living under conditions of segregation and racism in the South. And so the Soviet Union and other countries around the world were able to point to the hypocrisy of everything America said it stood for and how they were treating Black Americans. And so it was a huge embarrassment for the elites. But I can also tell you that the communists were very much involved in civil rights from the very beginning. 1909 was when the NAACP was founded, and so there were communists involved in that. 2 of the major black thought leaders of the 1800s, early 1900s, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Radically different. W.E.B. Du Bois, pretty much was a socialist. And so you had the communist influence, and you also had a lot of money being poured into the movement. So what was happening, you had people pointing out the contradictions between the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, all the things America was supposed to stand for, and how black Americans, and I would say Jews as well as any person of color, was being treated at the time. The country was overwhelmingly Christian. When we say Judeo-Christian nation, it was a Judeo-Christian nation. And so you could appeal to some of the ideals of what the Bible has to say about how you treat one another, as well as the Constitution. And so by the 1950s and the 1960s, it had reached the point that I would argue that America reached a consensus about what kind of nation they wanted to be. And with the coalition that included Democrats, Republicans, Christians, Jews, people from just about every religion were involved in the civil rights movement. And I would argue that it was successful, that civil rights laws were passed, and we became equal under the law. And with the 14th Amendment, we're supposed to have equal protection of the laws, and that is the law of the land. And so every person is supposed to enjoy the same rights under the law. Well, that happened in the 1960s. We had these civil rights acts passed. 1964 Civil Rights Act is probably the most important when you're talking about affirmative action and DEI and where we went wrong, because it prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, sex, color, national origin, and religion. And then it was later expanded to include other things such as disability, and eventually through Obama and Biden and the Supreme Court, it would also include sexual preferences. That was recently added to it, but it protected people against discrimination. And then the 1965 Voting Rights Act, that ensured all Americans, and in the South, it was very difficult for blacks to vote, even though in Mississippi and Alabama, a lot of those states, blacks may have been almost a majority of the population, they were not able to vote. And so the Voting Rights Act brought in federal registrars. 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act ended quotas for nations on the basis of race. And whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, it depends on your perspective, but that happened. And then in 1968, we passed the Open Housing Act, and that prohibited redlining and just various forms of discrimination. And we created a society when it came to housing, and I think that it's this way today. I can live in any neighborhood I can afford. Now, I can't afford to live in Belmead, but if I could afford to live in Belmead, my neighbors would welcome me. And so we became equal under the law. That did not last very long. The civil rights movement, we know some of the people that were notable from the 1960s. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., everyone knows him. Malcolm X, who was a part of the Nation of Islam. He left it before he was assassinated in 1965. And then Stokely Carmichael, who changed his name to Kwame Ture. He was a Caribbean, and he was a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, but he was the one that coined the phrase Black Power. And he later became involved with communism openly. He died outside the United States, but he became very radical. And at the same time that Dr. Martin Luther King was preaching nonviolence, you had people who were preaching violence. You had the rise of the Black Panthers. You had radicalized people like Angela Davis, who was one of Herbert Marcuse's students. And she's a university professor. And some of the radicals, the ones that survived the 1960s, they became university professors. And Angela Davis would have been one of them. Dr. King was associated with the Southern Christian Leadership Council. And so there are various figures that were a part of the turmoil of the 1960s. And the communists, again, they had their hand in every pie. And there are people that would argue that Dr. Martin Luther King had close ties with communists, and that the civil rights movement was partially funded by communists. The one thing I can tell you that it was a close alliance between blacks and Jews. That relationship would fractionalize later, but in the beginning it was a close relationship. There would not have been a successful black civil rights movement without the Jewish population. The 1960s, again, the world went to hell in a handbasket. And it started in 1962. Prayer was taken out of school. 1963, Bible reading was taken out of school. And 1963, we had riots. But there were other protest movements. And all of them, again, it was like the fruits of Marxism, the fruits of these strategies. The Marxists that set up camp at Columbia University in Brandeis and in the UC system, they had churned out students by then, and so their ideas were spreading across the US. And so you get the women's movement, you get the LGBT movement, Stonewall, 1968, the environmentalist movement, the anti-war movement, the countercultural movement. So it wasn't just the black civil rights movement. The 1960s was a time when it seemed like the whole world was upside down. And it created a shocking environment. The 1968 Democratic Convention, a lot of violence took place. It was in Chicago, and some people thought that the current, the more recent Chicago Democratic Convention might turn out the same way, but they were better able to be prepared to control the ones that would have created havoc over the summer. So these are some of the things that took place in the 1960s. The removal of prayer in school, Bible reading. You had the riots, just a general breakdown in law and order. You had the breakdown of black families. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who had been a Harvard professor, wrote about the black family. And at that time, only 25% of black households were headed by women. And he pointed out that there was a dangerous trend developing in the black communities, that there were too many female-headed households, and he was condemned for that. And people made the argument that the two-parent structure with mother, father, and their children, that was a European notion, and that there were alternative versions of families. And they also argued that minority culture was different, and that the European culture was just one way to do things. It was not superior in any other way. And during the 1960s, you had Lyndon Johnson and his vision of the Great Society, where government was going to end poverty, it was going to solve all the problems. Well, that didn't happen. And even though, millions, if not billions of dollars were poured into anti-poverty programs, there was a lot of theft, and of course poverty was not eradicated in the 1960s. You also got the rise of no-fault divorce. It started in California. Ronald Reagan signed the legislation. He would later say that was one of his greatest regrets. But no-fault divorce can be a factor into the breakdown of families. Non-discrimination morphed into racial preferences. And I'll talk more about that later. All during the time that our society was changing, these figures are important. Joseph McCarthy, and you've heard of the phrase McCarthyism, where he accused people of being communists. And the phrase McCarthyism was used to describe people, you know, they were extreme and they saw communists under every bed. And McCarthy warned that there were communists that had infiltrated our institution, that they were in Congress, they were in all of our institutions, where it turns out he was correct. And the revisionists have proven that Joseph McCarthy was no nut, that he was actually a truth teller. And Cleon Skousen, he wrote this book, The Naked Communist, in 1958. And it's relevant for us understanding the 60s because in 1963, his communist goals were read into the congressional record. And some of these these are the goals. Capture one or both of the political parties in the U.S., use technical decisions of the courts to weaken basic American institutions by claiming their activities violate civil rights, get control of the schools, use them as transmission belts for socialism, infiltrate the press, gain control of key positions in radio, TV, motion pictures, present homosexuality, degeneracy, and promiscuity as normal, natural, and healthy, infiltrate the churches, eliminate prayer, discredit the American Constitution. I've only listed some of the 45 goals. I would argue that all of them have been accomplished. Now, if you were to go to Wikipedia and Google Cleon Skousen, you would be told that he was probably some conspiracy theory, he was a nut. He was a professor, I believe at Brigham Young, and he was a former FBI agent. He was no nut, but he put this out, and since he wrote this, you know, in 1958, it was read into the congressional record in 1963. You look at what's happened to our society, and I think we can all agree that he was a prophet. Okay, Saul Alinsky, someone that you cannot talk about our society without talking about Saul Alinsky. And Saul Alinsky, where he's the father of community organizing, and he took some of these strategies and the goals, and you know, some people might say he's a Marxist. I don't know. What would you call him, James?
Radical's a good word.
Okay, all right. At any event, he had the idea of infiltrating, you know, the Catholic parishes, recruiting progressive priests, and so within Catholicism, there's some people that are really, you know, liberation theologists, and that's because they're Marxists. And Saul Alinsky was part of the people that came up with the idea of how to get into the churches, the language to use, how to manipulate the religious people. And they've never held religious people in high regard. They think religious people are stupid, and so they were able to really appeal to people's Christianity, to use the language to manipulate. And so we see that that gave them a huge advantage. And his tactics, we've talked about that: deception, infiltration, and manipulation. That is how the left has been able to take over our institutions. And we can see by looking at people's bios that many of the radicals of the 1960s, they are the ones that are running our universities. They are the deans of students. They are the ones that are allowing the universities to reach the point where they no longer are marketplaces of ideas that you get the radicalism. Alinsky, some of his ideas, some of the strategies that you see from him, he has 13 rules for radicals. Number 9, we very quickly see it, and it's when they really go after someone like, let's say, for example, politically, it might be like Donald Trump or J.D. Vance or Elon Musk. Pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, polarize it. And they would go after an individual and they would just hammer, 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 hammer until they try to destroy that person. Another is ridicule is man's most potent weapon. There is no defense. It's almost impossible to counterattack ridicule. Also, it infuriates the opposition, who then react to your advantage. And I would argue that many on the right are very good with ridicule. We're the best meme makers, the more conservative people, and we had the Babylon Bee. I wanted to give you some background on what was taking place and who some of the notable figures were. And now we're going to go do affirmative action because that's going to lead into DEI. And when affirmative action first came on the scene, it was 1961. And at that time, we had not passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so there was lots of discrimination taking place across the country. And so John F. Kennedy did the first executive order addressing this. But Eisenhower had also tried to address discrimination, but Kennedy did the first executive order. Johnson's executive order in 1965 is how we get in trouble. And it's because it followed the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act prohibiting discrimination. And with Johnson's executive order and a speech he gave at Howard University, his famous 1965 commencement address at Howard University, where he used the analogy of a shackled runner, that you don't take a shackled runner to the front of a line at a race and say, compete with all the others and believe you've been fair. And he said, we're moving to the next stage, not just equality of opportunity, but equality of results. And so that signaled the move from non-discrimination to preferential treatment. And then, not to be left behind, Richard Nixon, he was the one that brought us quotas through the Philadelphia program, racial quotas, but he himself issued an executive order, and he furthered the cause of affirmative action. And fast forward to Ronald Reagan. I was in college when Ronald Reagan was elected, and everyone believed that he would eliminate affirmative action. All it would have taken was the stroke of a pen. He could have written another executive order going back to the original purpose of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He didn't do that. And so with affirmative action, it's something that Democrats and Republicans have supported, but also it's something that there's a guy at UC San Diego, a sociologist named Scrutiny, and he has a book, The Ironies of Affirmative Action, and what he argues is that it was white male elites that pushed for affirmative action. And they were the ones that kept it alive. They were the ones that are responsible for the situation we're in today. And so maybe there was an expression of white guilt, but they pushed for something that was never one of the stated goals of the civil rights movement. The civil rights activists, from the very beginning, they pressed for non-discrimination and equal opportunity. There were no calls for reparations, and there were certainly no calls for preferential treatment. In fact, there were blacks who were being very successful in the federal government because of the civil service test. Straightforward. Whoever had the high score got the job. And so black people studied for the test, and there were other tests where black people were able to excel because they figured out what is the system, what are the qualifications, what do I have to do? And I can also say that the argument that institutions would be lily white if you didn't have racial preferences, that's not really true. One of the reasons why people pushed for non-discrimination was that in situations where there was no discrimination, racial and ethnic minorities would sometimes get admitted to colleges. When they showed up at the college, then they were turned away. There was a desire to have photographs removed from college applications. And if you were to look in the archives of the Black Journal of Higher Education, every now and then they would do an article, institutions across America that did not practice racial discrimination have black alumni going back to the 1800s. And Harvard University graduated its first black student, I believe it was like 1876 or something like that. And W.E.B. Du Bois got his PhD there in the 1930s. And so that whole idea that black people are so incompetent that they would never be able to meet standards is not really true. What is true is that at some point, we had the civil rights movement in the 60s, but elites decided that there were not enough people, there were not enough blacks, and so we moved towards a system where people were interested in quotas, that you needed to have a certain percentage of racial and ethnic minorities. And that's one of the causes, I believe, of the situation we're in today, where you have so many people that are clearly affirmative action or DEI appointees that have been exposed for plagiarism, that they have been placed into positions where they were not qualified. There's been a huge relaxing of standards, I would argue, because people, the demand outstripped the supply, and people wanted the quota, and so that's what they pushed for. But it wasn't always that way. Affirmative action's original purpose was noble. It evolved into racial preferences and quotas. By 1972, it had like 4 or 5 groups. Initially, it was about black and white. It was quickly expanded to include other groups. By the 1970s, there were white people that filed lawsuits about reverse discrimination. One of the first ones involved a Jewish student. And affirmative action was reborn as DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now you see how I was going to do that, right? Okay, what is diversity, equity, and inclusion? Well, it's not the same as the diversity that came out of the civil rights movement and affirmative action initially, because after the Civil Rights Act passed, there was a search for diversity, but what it meant was that recruiters in employment as well as higher education went to communities or schools where there were underserved groups seeking talented minorities, talented women, talented people. And so they recruited, and the goal was to identify these people, integrate them into whatever organization, whether it was for them to go to school or to get a job. It was about integration. And with integration, you come in, you become a part of the team. That was how it was initially supposed to work. And it was about equal opportunity. You bring people in, give them an equal opportunity to succeed or to fail. And I would argue that during the time that I came through, that I benefited from the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the equal opportunity. And so it didn't matter that I had been a high school dropout or anything about my background. What mattered was I got my foot in the door. I had to prove myself. I could have failed. And there were many people I saw who were racial and ethnic minorities who flunked out of school, they failed, they got fired. You did not have to succeed. It was all about getting your foot in the door, and equal opportunity was about the foot in the door, not guaranteeing results. With diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's about guaranteeing outcomes. And the inclusion is not about bringing a person in, integrating them into the environment, they become a part of the whole. It's about bringing in people with their group identities. You're supposed to maintain your group identity, and you're supposed to represent your group. You're not supposed to become a part of the whole. And during the initial era, 1960s, 1970s, we talked about assimilation. In political science, we had debates about America. Was America a salad bowl or a melting pot? And so there was aspirations for a colorblind society where we know that the salad bowl version of America is what we have, because with a salad bowl, you know, you put everything in there and it doesn't really blend, does it? And so that's pretty much what we have. Non-discrimination as the original goal of affirmative action. People like Ibram Kendi talks openly about they want discrimination in favor of racial and ethnic minorities or members of the LGBT community. So they have rejected non-discrimination as long as it favors the groups that they recognize. Integration was the original goal. Well, inclusion is not about integrating into the organization and becoming a part of the organization. It's almost like you have to have your chip on your shoulder to represent your group. and it'll never be enough. And it's like compromise if you decide that it's okay, that things are great, you're betraying your group. And equity is about equal outcomes. It's not about equal opportunity. And so with equity, it really lowers the standards, and it gives people a sense of entitlement that no matter how much effort they put in or lack thereof, they want the same outcome. And I can tell you that the racial and ethnic minorities I know, and some of them a lot older than I am from other generations, were people who worked very hard. And so they were not expecting anybody, not even wanting anybody to give them something. They did not feel entitled. But what I saw, even when I started college, were some racial and ethnic minorities, usually from affluent backgrounds, who felt very entitled. And they would say, they owe us this, they owe us this. And that's not something it's not a mindset I had. For me, I was always about trying to prove that I could compete. And so my attitude was, I'll show you. And if someone told me that I couldn't do something, I sure was going to do it. And so that was me, that was then, now's now. Diversity, equity, inclusion is jokingly referred to as didn't earn it. James may have come up with that. I don't know where it came from, but I like it. DEI now has a B for belonging. And so we're not just supposed to bring people in from marginalized groups. Don't just bring them into the environment. Make them feel like they belong. Now, whether or not you feel like you belong in a particular environment is a psychological state. And if you talk to young people, like a lot of young people, and even some old people, some of us feel like we belong. I think I'm always going to be the outsider. Maybe I don't belong anywhere. But you cannot make people feel like they belong. But DEI has added the B for belonging. And so people who feel uncomfortable, and sometimes it's because they really don't belong where they are, they can accuse you of making them feel like they don't belong because you made them feel uncomfortable even though they shouldn't have been there in the first place. DEI doesn't work. This is Karl Marx, and he's at the root of a lot of the problems. And DEI is rooted in Marxism, as James explained, and it uses conflict and tension to bring about change. And that's why it's so ridiculous when people talk about bringing about racial reconciliation and healing, or maybe they want to bring men and women together. You cannot do that using a conflict model. Reconciliation cannot come out of conflict. And so if your church is using a Marxist model, and they're talking about social justice, and they're using some of the language of the left, and they're trying to bring about racial reconciliation, they're doing the opposite of what they should be doing. If it's a church, they should be looking to biblical values and principles, because the Bible has everything we need to know about race and how to bring people together. With the left, everything changes, and so the definition of diversity has changed. And we are now at a point in history that if you own a dictionary that was published before 1990, you should hold on to that. It's a collector's item as far as I'm concerned, because the meanings of so many words have been changed. And you may have been in an argument with someone or a little debate, and you're going to settle it. So you Google and you're going to find a definition. You're not going to find the definition that you remembered, because the meaning of words have been changed. And so even with the word diversity, what it meant in 1828 is very different from what it means today. The state of being diverse, variety, I'm talking about 2024, a range of different things. Newspapers here's an example. Newspapers were obliged to allow a diversity of views to be printed. We know that's not happening. But the main thing is The definition includes the practice or quality of including or involving people from a range of different social and ethnic backgrounds and of different genders and sexual orientations. And it's not just with diversity. You can pick any word that the left is using. Look at what the dictionary said, back in the 80s or early 90s, and look at what it says today. On a lot of these issues, the definition has totally changed. And so how does it all fit together? Well, affirmative action ultimately led to DEI and CRT. I argue that DEI is affirmative action on steroids. And I will also argue that the left shifted its language after the Supreme Court ruled in the Michigan cases in 2006 that affirmative action would probably only be needed for another 25 years. That was back in 2006. And so they had to figure out a way to make it permanent. And so they shifted. We're not debating affirmative action anymore and racial preferences. We're debating DEI as if it was just totally new, but it's the same old, just repackaged. Now I get to what I have observed as someone that was able to watch history from the front row. I think the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the laws we passed were good laws, that they were needed. And had we stuck with that, we would have a better society and we would not be in the situation that we're in now. Affirmative action's preferential treatment of protected groups, it is reverse discrimination. And that's a violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And so, I mean, it's that simple. DEI and affirmative action as practiced as preference programs violate the Constitution and they violate our civil rights laws. And that's one of the reasons that the Supreme Court ruled last year that race-based college admissions violated the Equal Protection Clause, and it also violated the civil rights laws. And that's why I wrote my book, The Adversity of Diversity, and argued that DEI programs discriminate in the same way, and that these programs are unconstitutional, and that people should challenge them for the same grounds that the students challenge the race-based admissions programs. DEI is not the way to go. Businesses are told that they must join the battle for social justice. They must set up DEI programs, so a lot of them have done that. They must hire a DEI officer, have a DEI department. They've done that. They have these affinity groups. These affinity groups are groups where you encourage to segregate yourself with whichever group you identify with the most. You join that group and you sit around and you gripe about everything that's being done to your group. So there are gripe sessions in the workplace as well as colleges and universities. And DEI offices tell institutions they need to re-educate their employees. They need to know about systemic racism and oppression, and they really press the critical race theory, dividing the world into oppressors and non-oppressors. So social justice ahead, that is language that's related to Marxism. So if your pastor starts talking about social justice, you need to re-educate him. Good news, DEI is dying. And this is not even the updated data. Because in I think this year they released new data, but the number of DEI positions, they have dropped. All the tech companies have downsized their DEI programs. Some have eliminated them. 22 states, and again, this was maybe a year ago, had 40 bills to regulate DEI. And I know that the University of Texas system, Florida, Utah, and I believe University of North Carolina system now have eliminated DEI programs at public institutions. They can't do anything about private schools, but at public institutions, they have eliminated DEI programs. DEI versus return on investment. During the time I was teaching at Vanderbilt and Princeton, the students, when they graduated, what they wanted to do was to work for McKinsey, the consulting company. So, it paid very well, and that was like, you graduate, you get a job at McKinsey, and then you decide what you're going to do. Well, they have been sued over several things, but one is, last year it was discovered that their DEI studies, the studies that companies were using, they had convinced companies that if they adopted DEI, that they would have larger profits and all these wonderful things would happen in the workplace, that those studies could not be replicated, that they were garbage studies. And so McKinsey's studies have been discredited when it comes to DEI. And the return on investment is not there. In fact, it's more likely to disrupt the workplace. When the diversity, equity, and inclusion officers come in, they send their weekly emails. They're trying to force everyone to celebrate someone else's special day. All of these things are more likely to disrupt the workplace. They create conflict. They take emphasis away from profits and profitability. They stifle conversations at staff and board meetings. And I can tell you, I have a company called Real Unity Training Solutions. I'll talk about it a little bit later. But we've had people that were owners, founders of companies, tell us that they're not comfortable speaking at their own meetings because they're afraid that they will offend someone. And so you created a situation where companies were established with a particular mission, and the employees have so much power that the owners are afraid to speak up. And you know that there's something wrong when that's the case. You have conversations at staff and board meetings where everyone is just tiptoeing around, trying to be politically correct because they don't want to offend people. And it can lead to higher employee turnover. And sometimes it's the most talented employees leave, and they don't always say why they're leaving. Like if they're forced to attend a training and they feel like they were forced to sit there and be beaten up on because of their race or their sex or whatever, a lot of times people will not say anything, they'll just go job hunting. And it can negatively impact brand identity. We know about Bud Light, and there's a whole list of other companies that we could list that have been negatively impacted because of their pushing, woke capitalism or whatever. So DEI, it's problematic, it's dying, and one of the reasons that it's dying is that companies are trying to avoid lawsuits. And there are white people who are successfully winning lawsuits, as well as women. White people winning lawsuits, men are winning lawsuits. And lawsuits are being settled. And so you don't hear about all of them in the news, but at Starbucks, there was a white female that won a $25 million settlement because of racial discrimination. She was fired, and it was related to that incident where there were some black guys, I think in Philadelphia, they were in the shop, they were not buying anything, they were asked to leave, and it became this national crisis. They shut down all their stores, they retrained all of their employees, and if you look at what happened after that is Starbucks became unsafe. They ended up having to close a lot of their stores. They closed the stores in neighborhoods where that were more crime prone. And the last time I was at the Starbucks in Green Hills, to use the bathroom, you had to ask for the key. And years ago, the bathroom was always open. Anyone could use the bathroom, but not anymore. You have to ask to use the bathroom. And so DEI and CRT and the efforts to please everyone often results in policy changes that are not to the benefit of the employees, and it opens companies up to lawsuit. And in the case of the white woman who won the $25 million judgment, she was also awarded back pay. And with the men who have won lawsuits, and also Christians have won lawsuits, and I'm sure people of other religious groups, but to tell a man, you have toxic masculinity, James. James, you're part of the problem. Your group is the root of all evil. Our society would be better off if your ancestors just shut up, go back to wherever you came from. I can't get away with saying that as a DEI trainer. And if I do say that to you, I hope you recorded it, because you have rights. You have civil rights. And years ago, when I used to teach courses on civil rights movement in the 1960s, white people didn't know they had civil rights. They thought it was something that applied to racial and ethnic minorities. But today, fast forward to 2024, 2023, white people discovered that they have civil rights, and they are exercising those civil rights. And I think it's a good thing, because I think we're better off if we have a society where non-discrimination and adherence to the law and the Constitution, we're better off if that's the way our society is geared. Some of the problems with DEI: conflict and disunity, viewpoint discrimination, and employees don't get along better. There's no data suggesting that it makes workplaces better off. Don't despair. I have good news. I believe that we can have diversity without discrimination. Diversity does not have to be a dirty word. We can have united teams that can create a shared mission, vision, values, and success. And so, thank you. I thought that was my applause. That was the door opening. I hear people saying that unity, when they hear unity, that it just rubs them the wrong way, because they're so sick of that word. And I find it so interesting because, President Biden, in his inaugural address, he talked a lot about unity. And I was surprised, because my company, Real Unity Training Solutions, at that time it was Unity Training Solutions. When I was talking about unity, there were not a lot of people talking about unity. Then all of a sudden the left discovered the word unity, and they've sort of turned it upside down. But unity is a good word. And what I think we need to do is we need to go back to basics. If it's a company, and you are the owner of a company, you get to set the tone for your organization. And there are things that we can do, but I'm gonna skip over all of this in the interest of time. But we need to go back to basics. Part of the basics we need to go back to is the civil rights movement's original goals, the laws of the land, and the Constitution. I think we need to replace affinity groups with teams. We need to understand civil rights laws and protections, because there are civil rights laws that are good. We need to understand them, and we need to focus on building healthy teams. And there are things that we can do other than the DEI training in the workplace. And we need all organizations to get back on mission. Again, we can diversity without discrimination. When it comes to college, reallocate all that, millions of dollars, use it for high schools and for remedial programs, whatever needs to be done. I think there's nothing wrong with outreach and recruitment of talented individuals, as long as it's done on a non-racial basis. There's nothing wrong with giving people opportunities. And we need to end speech codes and restrictions. And we need to return to e pluribus unum, out of many one. And again, we can have diversity without discrimination. And we need to go back to basics. What can you do if you happen to be a person that has been discriminated against, or you're in a workplace where there's discrimination? You should document it. You need to know the laws of the land. You need to not only know your rights, but be willing to stand up for your rights. And that's a problem, because some people will gripe about what's taking place. They may see discrimination against themselves or against someone else in the workplace. It's important for you to stand up for your rights, but also maybe stand up for someone else's rights, or let them know, inform them of their rights. And document. Racial and ethnic minorities, we've learned to document discrimination. I think white people are coming along, but they may not be as good at it as we are. Okay, these are some resources that I have. Black Eye for America, How Critical Race Theory is Burning Down the House. That was my bestseller. The Adversity of Diversity, that talks about this current moment and why we need to get rid of DEI. And resources, Real Unity Training. And with that, my last challenge to you is, do you have courage to step out of the box? And whether it's about, political issues, or about challenging what you see that's wrong when it comes to these issues, these identity issues, it's going to require some people being brave enough to step out of the box. And the very fact that you're here today tells me that you have a lot of courage. So thank you for being here. And with that, I am done. Follow me on social media if you dare. I am quite active on Twitter, or X, and I post photographs sometimes of the Nashville skyline and the skies, and I have nicknamed the person sending those photographs Laurie Skywatcher, and she's here today. Laurie, will you stand up? So that concludes my presentation. And if you want to take a stretch break, just stand up and stretch, and then James and I will answer any questions you have.